Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your practice. My name is Thia Powers, and I'm here to welcome you to IMC Charlotte. Tonight, we are going to explore, we're going to kick off a series, and we're going to explore the Four Noble Truths, a fundamental teaching of the Buddha. And so we begin tonight with understanding dukkha. And I think that probably almost all of us feel anxious at some point in time. Dukkha translates to suffering, anxiety, being uncomfortable, unpleasantness. So, with everything that's happening globally, nationally, locally, and even on a personal level, we have plenty of reason for anxiety, for dukkha. Things are uncertain, things are unreliable, and essentially, things are ungovernable. We cannot control them. And we don't like that. We don't want that. And it's not our fault that we seek safety and certainty. Our brains are set up for survival. But this life and this world is always shifting in subtle and in radical ways. And it has always been so. So I'm certainly not immune to anxiety. Anxiety is what brought me to this path and why I've chosen to stick with it. And this may be odd for folks that are new to this path, but for me, this is how I have learned to be kind to myself by not avoiding unpleasantness. I've begun to see it clearly in every day in varying degrees in my own life. And I've started to be kinder to myself and to others. Life is already challenging, and we can make it less so by learning to take some of the drama out, by removing some of the fuel for the dukkha fire, so to speak. And this is not apathy, but by being genuinely curious about this. So tonight's talk is the beginning of a four-part series that looks deeply into what the Buddha called noble truths, specifically the Four Noble Truths. He looked into the ebbing and flowing of experiences and mind moments that we call life, including, of course, our bodily aches and pains, our emotional challenges, and seeing clearly the ongoing stress and the natural longing for things to be different. After much study and practice, he declared, this is a universal experience. We're all in this condition, and it's commonly referred to as the human condition. In the language of his time, the word for this existential anxiety was dukkha. So tonight's time together will be spent looking at this human condition, the fact that there is anxiety or suffering or dukkha as a part of each person's life. So I apologize if you thought this was going to be the talk on joy or the loving kindness talk, and it won't hurt my feelings if you quietly leave. I understand your aversion to looking at suffering and dukkha, but know that this very aversion is part of the sign of dukkha, avoiding it. So Gautama the Buddha has been called the great physician. He gained this title because he gave his followers a diagnosis, a cause, a remedy, and a way to attain the remedy for their suffering. He declared after years of intense study and practice, and then subsequent enlightenment, that we're all born into suffering. And he said he was proclaiming something that he knew people would not want to hear. He considered not teaching because this is a difficult truth. Further, he said that the cause of suffering was craving and clinging and arises due to certain causes and conditions. He said, thirdly, that a remedy could be had, and that there is a possibility of reaching a state where dissatisfaction and suffering has ceased. And fourthly, he said, the remedy is contained in the Eightfold Path. So this stuff is not easy to teach. We are not inclined to be interested in or want to study pain and suffering. But if we don't admit the problem of pain and take the medicine, which is looking at it more closely, we can't ever improve the symptoms, and we'll never have the possibility of living a more fulfilling life or ridding ourselves possibly of this malady. So last week, Renard spoke about the 5 remembrances, and that was a good prelude for us tonight. He pointed out some of the inescapable truths of our existence, and he said it would be good if we remembered them daily. They may seem kind of harsh, but when we really let them land, they actually soften the heart to the truths that we are born into, and on some level that we already know. These truths overlap a great deal with the first noble truth. We're all of the nature to become old, to become ill, and eventually to die, to lose all that is near and dear to us, and our actions are our only true belongings. And this is what we looked at last week. These are interesting things to hear over and over, but the purpose for this repetition is wholesome. Knowing this on a heart level, perhaps even on a cellular level, is critical to beginning to understand our own human existence and everything that comes along with it. So this, in fact, is the beginning of right view, of understanding cause and effect. So we'll see how the Dharma teachings are woven together like a splendid tapestry, telling a story, as most old tapestries often do. Now, I don't know about you, but I was not raised with these truths. No fault of my Southern parents, one of whom was a longtime Presbyterian and the other who pleaded agnostic and clung, however, to the 10 Commandments. Apart from what religious system we may have been raised with, many of us are brought up by people who themselves were mostly taught to get ahead, to make something of yourself. And so they taught us to be somebody, get out there and make your mark. And we in turn teach our kids, you be you, go get your slice of life. And this is very much about individuating, about accumulating wealth when possible, and maybe making a family of some kind. And we're not taught so much about these fundamental things, about the human condition, existential angst, and the fact that we need to mentally and psychologically prepare for the inevitability of death while we're alive. How have we made our way through life? Many aspects of the culture are saturated with the idea of getting and not sharing, with comparing, and with concern for looking good and appearing prosperous. We don't talk much to ourselves or our kids about these tough things like constant change. Suffering comes when we do not know how to cope with or accept that all things change. Suffering comes again from our nature of being attached to people, to animals, to material possessions, and especially to thoughts and beliefs. Some folks deny that they are suffering. I would like to gently suggest that perhaps they've not yet penetrated their own personal conditioning around change, attachment, not self, and death. Or that the word suffering might simply occur as too epic too large. And so folks miss out on the fact that we have daily cravings for food, to be warmer or cooler, for sleep, trying to manage this ungovernable body. These are the ongoing signals of our condition, and we will die without honoring them. We don't have a choice around this, and we're used to it. Taking care of the body must be cared for and one day gives out. It has an expiration date. Also, as students of the Buddha's teachings, we're navigating the intricacies of the mind. This mind interacting with other minds, it's a subtle and constant reality. It can be so interesting. It can also deliver pain and confusion and a lot of not knowing. Actually, our increased awareness as meditators eventually does deliver a more sensitive way of being that requires some additional homework to bring about additional understanding. And that's what we're doing tonight. We might notice that we need tools in order to meet life in a skillful way, that our hearts feel more open and maybe more vulnerable to all of this suffering and anxiety. Bhante Gunaratana says in relation to all this, that the way out of a trap is to begin to study the trap itself. A trap cannot keep you if it has been taken apart, effectively dismantled. I want to share a quote from Philip Moffat, Dancing with Life, a book about the Four Noble Truths. He writes, "When you learn to be with the truth of your suffering and the suffering of those for whom you care in a mindful, compassionate manner, you are ennobled. Being able to bear your pain with dignity empowers you to examine your suffering and bring an end to it." We might remember that our meditation practice brings us sukha before dukkha. Sukha is a sweetness. When we first discover the joy of sitting quietly, of finding our inner world, of just being with the steadiness of our breath and the solidity of our body, the foundations of our practice. And we discover that it takes almost no effort to be present. It can be utterly restful and effortless to dwell in presence most of the time. I've got it, we think. And on one level, we do, because this is much better than not knowing awareness and not being able to sit quietly with the self and the mind. And quite frankly, the sweetness and the rest for the mind and the heart that is possible just might be what keeps us coming back. Eventually, on another level, though, we may sense there's something more, and we choose to step across a threshold into another room and sense that there's work to be done to understand the mind and its constant cravings. In the collected teachings of Ajahn Chah, in his chapter on Dukkha, he writes, "My way of training involves some suffering, because understanding suffering is the first step on the Buddha's path to enlightenment. He instructed that we see our suffering and understand how it begins, also how it ends, and the path that we can follow for a way out. This is not easy. This is for the noble ones. If you don't go this way, there is no way out." So this teaching is called noble. It takes courage to see for ourselves the condition that we're in. It takes perseverance and a willingness to keep engaging with difficulty. It takes a certain kind of intelligence that is perhaps more whole body related than head related. And this kind of inquiry begins to shape our experience over time in a way that makes us more humble, more resilient, and maybe brings us a taste of wisdom. Of course, we still have pleasant moments too. We sit in the morning with a warm cup of coffee, this morning listening to the rain, meditating, maybe doing yoga. These are all quite wholesome and pleasant. But notice two things. These things are not problematic, except when we tend to cling to them. And these experiences change and are gone. We cannot stay in pleasant experiences all the time. Absolutely nothing stays, except, according to the teachings, our actions and the karma we generate. These are of value to us and to others now and in the future. The steady acceptance of impermanence in our life works to change the experience of living. It smooths out some of the bumps, and we might notice we're less prone to agitation than when we first began. Our partners and our families and friends will thank us for this. However, when I gently let go of a position or an opinion that I'm clinging to, and I gain a degree of peace, and I move away from stress, does this mean I don't have opinions? Not at all. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean I can discern better where to put my energy, where it can do the most good, and not waste it arguing or creating bad energy or being in online chat rooms where no one's opinion is likely to change. But here's the kicker. Only if we approach letting go with an easy, non-grasping kind of intention does this action of letting go have integrity. So I'm not letting go in order to get something. I'm simply willing to open my hand or sometimes watch as things fall away all on their own. So I hope we can see there's no shortage of striving, unhappiness, or stress. And the point here is that our relationship to this striving or stress is where the alchemy can occur. This is where the lasting treasure can be found. This is where possibility of patience grows, where compassion begins to bloom, and equanimity is learned in this space of letting go and letting be. There's a brief story I'd like to share with you about our word for the night, our word of dukkha, and where it came from. Around 2,600 years ago or more, there were nomadic peoples called Aryans. They were cattle and horse breeding people who migrated using vehicles that were pulled by teams of oxen, and they brought the Sanskrit language into India. When we look at this word, their word, the ancient prefix du, we find that it means difficult, bad, or faulty. And then the root ka meant empty or space or whole. So one of the meanings for these nomads all these years ago who depended on carts with wheels drawn by oxen to go many hundreds of miles, this word referred to the axle hole of a wagon wheel. When the axle fits badly into the wheel, perhaps because the hole is not in the center or it's not the right shape, the whole wagon is compromised. And they were guaranteed an unpleasant and bumpy ride. So to me, this is perfect. It's kind of funny. It's an analogy for our ride through life. And you even can remember that the Buddhist symbol for the Eightfold Path is a wagon wheel with 8 spokes. So it kind of connects to this whole idea of the escape from dukkha. If you take the Buddhist cosmology, there's an ongoing process of birth, death, and rebirth. And so dukkha would make for a very long and difficult ride if we believe in rebirth. The term sukha that I used a few minutes ago Sounds sweet like sugar, and it is. It means a good ride, a happy place to be, and one of the meanings is related to wholesome actions, deeds, pure intentions, and the commitment to not harming the self or others. So we find that there are three kinds of dukkha sprinkled throughout the teachings of the Buddha. I'll spare you all the definitions, but the three main categories seem to be related to the three characteristics of existence worth knowing about. The first one is the dukkha of dissatisfaction and avoidance. This is our natural aversion to physical suffering and pain and mental suffering. This distress is due to experiences that we don't want but cannot control, that things are inherently imperfect. So this is called dukkha dukkha. The second kind of dukkha is the dukkha of impermanence or change, the frustration of disappearing happiness, that experiences are always changing to neutral or unpleasant as the causes and conditions change. This also shows the incapability of things or experiences to provide lasting happiness for us. This is called viparinama dukkha, the dukkha of impermanence or change. And then lastly, there's the dukkha of not self, of emptiness. This is an impersonal truth that all forms of life are changing, are impermanent, and without any inherent substance. This is a scientific reality, and it is the Dharma of emptiness. It relates to existential angst. And this is a profound truth to be grappled with, perhaps at some later point in our studies. And this is called sankhara dukkha. So, on an up note, the good news is that these truths are actually liberating. They blow things wide open for investigation. They help us see how the trap is constructed, so to speak, so we can begin to understand it and dismantle it together if we choose. For this, we have friends in the Sangha here. We look to other online Sanghas, and Sanghas spread throughout the country and even the world are exploring these very same truths. We have access to many teachers to study with, and we practice ehipassiko. What are the teachings like for me? How does this land for me? Reading and practicing the Dharma each day guides us, and we can see how things resonate in our day-to-day lives. This has been an interesting study for me preparing for this because dukkha shows up all the time, every day. And now sometimes I can just laugh about it and mumble to myself, dukkha, there it is. So we don't practice to get something, to snuff out dukkha. That is the side effect, which is lovely. We practice because it's good, it's wholesome, it's wise. One of my very first teachers said, do the practice and all will come. So thank you for your practice tonight. I hope something in there was of benefit to you.